Okay.
Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. So we're finishing up the area in Parshat Re'eh that speaks about kashrut and the animals that are permissible and the animals which aren't. And I don't believe we did the Rashi on this particular verse. So it says, Kol of tahor tochelu. Every or any pure bird you may eat. You may eat. And remember, the listing was of impure birds. So please notice right before it says the chosherta of tameh hulachem, right? So that's any that's talking about basically insects, right? Swarming creatures, etc., that are impure, right? And again, it lists the impure. So it's already told you you're not to eat impure birds. But here it says you shall eat pure birds. Okay, so let's take a look. Rashi makes an important point here. This is actually an interesting and important halachic principle. So he says, "Kol of tahor tochelu," right? Every pure bird you shall eat. So that's a positive commandment. Velo et hatameh, but not the impure. So what's the point of this? I mean, it's already told you not to eat any impure flying creature. Right. Bali tain say. So there's a halachic principle here that in doing that, in adding this positive commandment of you shall eat pure birds, Bali tain say, it comes to place a positive commandment al lotase on a negative commandment. Right? The negative commandment was you shall not eat impure birds, and now it's saying you shall eat pure birds. Now, having said you shall not eat impure birds, the implication, of course, is that you have permission, right, to eat pure birds. But when it says you shall eat pure birds, it adds a certain level of saying, that when you eat a bird that is pure, you're fulfilling a positive commandment, right? And he says, likewise, bivhema, right? Regarding cattle, it says, ota tochelu, them you shall eat. Velo behemat me'ah, but not an impure cattle. And it's possible that it's saying that there's this connection, right? That when it says you shall eat pure animals, pure birds, it's the implication is, and you shall not eat impure birds or impure animals. For love haba, so in other words, you hear what I just said. I said there's a positive commandment. It says you shall eat pure birds, right? And the implication is the implication, right, is that you shall not eat impure birds. And this is love haba miklal asay. That is a negative commandment. You shall not eat impure birds. That comes out of a positive commandment, out of a general positive commandment, right? It's a general commandment. It doesn't specify what birds. It's talking about a whole category, but please excuse me, it's a positive commandment, but the implication is a negative commandment. So, so he says that if it's a negative commandment that comes out of a positive, that is inferred from a positive commandment, I say, it's seen as a positive commandment, right? It's the negative commandment itself is seen as a positive commandment, la'avor alehem ba'aseh velo ta'aseh, so that if in fact you infringe the negative commandment, if you transgress the negative commandment, you've now transgressed both a negative commandment, the implied commandment, and the positive commandment, because it's already told you, you shall eat pure birds. So now that, in a sense, you are guilty of two violations of both a negative commandment, the implied negative commandment, and the positive commandment. And that's a general rule, halachik principle of, it's called lav haba miklal aseh. Here's the Hebrew, lav haba miklal aseh. So the positive commandment, which implies a negative commandment. Okay. Because I think also that the Torah is not telling us that it is a positive mitzvah to eat birds. In other words, if you don't want to eat birds at all, you're not violating a positive commandment. It's more, I think the point that Rashi is making as I meditate on what we're reading here is that this positive commandment is there to imply the negative commandment. And that's what Rashi is trying to teach us. So that it's not like you should go, seeing that every time you have a chicken dinner, you'll fulfill, a kosher chicken dinner, you're actually performing a positive mitzvah in the normal kind of sense. Okay. All right, going on. Lo tuchlu chol nevela. So it says you shall not eat any nevela. A nevela essentially is an animal that dies of its own, that is not kosher slaughtered. And the fact is that there are people who sometimes will eat beef, and in fact, at one time in my life, I did eat beef. In other words, I wouldn't eat pork, and I wouldn't eat meat that was directly forbidden. All right, but I might go to a restaurant and order beef. Okay, so the point here, though, is, and then the whole thing is, and claim that I was keeping biblical kashrut. And the answer is that this sentence, you shall not eat any nevela, is a biblical commandment. And the truth is, it is also talking essentially, even though a nevela essentially is an animal that dies by itself, right? As opposed to a treifa. A treifa is an animal that's killed, that was killed by another animal. Treifa taruf essentially means torn, but the implication is that it's an animal that was not properly slaughtered, that it was not slaughtered according to the laws of kashrut. And likewise, nevela is a has the similar kinds of implications. So that to say that you're keeping biblical kashrut still includes not eating unkosher beef, and even though the animal may be permissible, the Torah still forbids us to eat animals that are not properly slaughtered. So anyway, here we go. Let's go on with it, right? Lager asher bisharecha kitnena. Yes, David, question.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. So, does that mean that we can? It's only kosher if if a person has slaughtered it and therefore can you can go undergo rituals. I mean, does that mean like if an animal, is dies or is killed, is killed by another animal, it's forbidden. You can't eat that. It has to be slaughtered by human hands.
Correct.
Oh, okay. All
Yes,
right.
yes. And it has to be properly slaughtered too. Okay. Now remember, we're saying animal. I'm not including fish, all right?
Okay.
And birds are also have to be shechted, but the laws of shechting a bird are different from laws of shechting a large animal, right? Like, because we're only allowed really cattle, sheep, and goats, right? And of course deer. We're allowed, any ungulate we're allowed. But essentially, the what happens in slaughtering the animal, the laws of slaughtering are very similar, or maybe even identical, you might say, to the laws of slaughtering for the sake of an offering. In other words, there's a connection between slaughtering an animal for our own private use and slaughtering the animal in order to put it up on the altar. In other words, that we realize we're taking away a significant life and that there's a sacred act, there's some level of sanctity involved in doing that.
Ah, so that's how okay. So it's related in that sense as a holy act, right? Or related to
Absolutely.
a
Absolutely.
holy. Yeah.
Well, right. It
Yeah.
becomes a holy act also because it's a mitzvah,
Got
right?
it.
Because it's a commandment. And
Yep.
commandments are essentially what we're doing is responding to a divine a divine mandate. So that makes it a holy act as well. And you'll see it. This, we're going to go with, if we continue this sentence, you'll see it says, Ki am kadosh ata lashem, for you are a sacred nation to the Lord. Okay.
Got
So
it.
the
Okay.
the other
Thank
thing
you.
is, yeah, and
Yep.
essentially, by the way, kosher slaughter involves basically severing the windpipe and the esophagus. That you have to, and that, by the way, renders the animal immediately unconscious. So that's those two have to be severed at in the particular place along the windpipe, etc. The specific place which it's permitted. There are a bunch of laws involved. The knife cannot have any serrations in it. It has to be perfectly smooth, etc., etc. So that it's essentially one immediate act that slaughters the animal. So, and it,
Wow.
yeah, okay. I mean, I don't want to go too far on that level of
Yep.
saying that it's preventing cruelty to animals, because there is also a practice that is legitimate called hoisting and shackling, where they take the animal's legs and they hoist the animal up so that basically it's upside down, and so that the shechita is performed, in a downward motion on the neck of the animal. And I don't think hoisting and shackling is exactly a wonderful act on the animal. I will tell you that the one shechita that I actually observed, the animal was not treated that way. It was, in fact, there was a big notice saying that, that the ASPCA had been consulted to make sure that the animal was not treated in a cruel manner when it was being slaughtered. And essentially, I could only describe it as a sort of a cage that came down to hold the animal's horns in place so that the head would not move. Right. So it would basically, and the animal was standing on its feet, etc. So it was just that the animal's head could not move, so that when the shochet, when the person doing the slaughtering did it, the animal wouldn't be jerking or anything, and it would be instantaneous. And it was. I observed everything, and as the shochet drew the knife, and it has to be a draw, by the way, it cannot be a push, it cannot be a push forward, it has to be one clean draw. The animal's eyes glazed immediately. It was like instantaneously. So it was actually a very profoundly moving moment, at least for me, because I'd never actually watched that happening. Anyway, let's go on with the sentence, right? So, yeah, okay, let's go on. Right. La ger asher bisharecha, and he's going to define what a ger is here. Rashi's going to tell us the stranger that is in your gates. In other words, it's a non-Jew, right? Who's living amongst you, who is in your gates. Titnena, you can give it to that person for achala, right? And he can eat it. He has permission to consume that. Or machor lenochri, or you can sell it to a stranger. And this, of course, is a non-Jew, meaning one who worships idols, etc. Okay? So there's a difference here being made between a ger asher bisharecha and a nochri, so that Rashi is going to have to explain what this ger asher bisharecha, this stranger that is within your gates, actually refers to. So why can you not eat it, but they can? Ki am kadosh ata, for you are a sanctified nation, ladonai, to the Lord Elohecha your God, and then the famous lo vashel gedi, you shall not seethe a kid bechalev imo, in its mother's milk. Okay, the famous law that has to do with mixing milk with meat. All right, so let's take a look at the Rashis on this. Lager asher b'sharecha. So he gets on to defining what we mean lager asher b'sharecha. So he says ger toshav. This is a non-Jew who is residing amongst you and residing amongst the Jewish people. Shekibel alav, who is accepted upon himself. Shelo la'avod avodah zara, who has given up the practice of idolatry, who does not practice idolatry, but they haven't completely converted to Judaism, ve'ochel nevelot, but he still eats non-kosher meat. So he's given up idol worship, but he still eats non-kosher meat. Let's take a look. I actually did some little bit of research on this, and here we go. Right here, this is actually from AI. Right, in Jewish law, a ger toshav refers to a non-Jew who resides in the land of Israel and commits to observing the 7 laws of Noah. And here we go, which include prohibitions against idolatry, murder, theft, sexual immorality, and blasphemy, and requirements for establishing courts of justice and respecting living creatures. Essentially, it's a resident alien who, while not converting to Judaism, commits to a basic ethical and religious code recognized by Jewish law. So there's, I think, actually a wonderful explanation of what a ger toshav is. Okay, so a nochri, of course, is someone who may well still be worshiping idols. Ki am kadosh ata Hashem, for you are a sanctified nation to God. Here we are. So being told that, it says, Kadesh et atzmacha b'mutar lach. It says, sanctify yourself with things that are permissible to you. We are allowed to eat, right? We are allowed to eat kosher food. And I'm wondering to myself if what the Sifrei is also saying is that in doing things that are permissible, as opposed to commanded, right? Mutar means it's permissible. There's a difference between something that's permissible as opposed to something that is commanded. And it's possible that the Sifrei is trying to make the point that things that are permissible and not commanded still require, in other words, still can involve an act of sanctification. So that so here, for example, in the case of food, which we're permitted to eat, we should do it in a way that is that is still nevertheless a sacred act. But he goes on to say, right, Dvarim hamutarim, right, things that are permissible. For acherim nohagim bahem isur, right? This is interesting, right? So it says things that are permissible, and others consider them to be forbidden. Al tatirem bifnehem. Do not say that they are permissible in their presence, which is an interesting concept. In other words, how I understand this is it's saying that you may be permitted to do something, let's say to consume a food, but if they say they do not consider it permissible, you shouldn't eat it in their presence. You shouldn't act in a way that allows you more license if they consider it not permissible. And I think that's what it's saying here, right? So in other words, here it may be permissible to you, but if others say it's not permissible, even if they're not Jewish or whatever, you should act out of respect for them and not say that it is permissible. Al tavashel gadi. Do not see. Yes, David.
Oh, okay, so maybe you're going to get to this, but like, who makes that decision? I mean, that sounds very arbitrary. That could apply to anybody or anything in terms of that. It's basically saying, you have to follow what somebody else says, even if it doesn't. It's not what you think, right?
Well,
So
it's a little more specific than that. It's talking about putting a negative commandment on yourself. In other words, it's a situation where someone else says this isn't allowed, okay? And though it is allowed to you, you also say it isn't allowed. By the way, I think this is a great basis for a practice in a Jewish community where some of the Jewish community doesn't keep kosher and they're having a communal meal. What this particular statement would be saying, in this particular case, you should make sure the meal's kosher, even though a large segment of those people, even the majority possibly, hold that it is permissible.
Okay, but it, if you take that a step further, then so if you're eating with someone who's not keeping kosher,
Yeah.
well, yeah, so or whatever. So and if they said it's not permissible, okay, so you have to apply both. Is it a double application, applying what's permissible and not to yourself, and then applying what's permissible and not permissible from the other party, or how does that work?
So I think, and honestly, we're talking about things that the other party would consider are forbidden.
Right.
And even though you know, according to Jewish law, it may be permissible, you should still, out of respect for them, not do it. Because the implication is that if you say it's allowed and they say it's not allowed, right? It's acting in a more licentious way. In other words, as a Jew, you're now acting with a license that you're displaying a license in front of other people who don't. I mean, there are definitely practical applications here, even where there may be simply a difference of practice, even though it could be between Jews themselves. I mean, clearly, I think it also applies to how it might apply to a non-Jew is interesting. But a non-Jew may say, okay, so I'll give you an example. We're allowed to drink alcohol, okay? But if you're having a meal with a Muslim, they are forbidden to drink alcohol. You shouldn't be drinking alcohol in the presence of a Muslim or a Methodist Christian who also, according to, as far as I understand, Methodism, he forbids, they are forbidden to drink alcohol.
Okay, that makes sense. But and this only applies to food, right? I mean, it's not a
Well, it might apply to other things too, but food would be a good example,
okay.
a
Got
very
it.
common example. I can't think of other examples right off the bat. Okay. But I think there might well be other examples. But I mean, but because eating is such a very, very basic, you know, activity.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Sure. No, no, no. And I thank you for wanting to pull this out a little bit and develop it. All right. So we've got we'll try and finish this up right, not to seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Let's see what it says here. Okay. All right. He says, Lo Tavashel Gedi, right here. And this is in Tractate Chulin, which, as I said, basically deals with foods that, especially meat, and how meat is to be slaughtered, etc., to allow it for general usage. So it says Shalosh Pamim, right? It mentions this particular law of not seething a kid in its mother's milk is mentioned 3 times in the Torah, right? Prat lechaya. So one time it is mentioned for animals. Ula ofot, and in other words, it would refer to wild animals, which sounds to me like it would include deer, right? Ula ofot, and to birds, ula vehema tme'ah. So it refers to interestingly, it's talking about a non-kosher animals. Now that's interesting. So in other words, even if you're not cooking it in order to consume it, you shouldn't be doing that regardless. You shouldn't be seething this meat. It's interesting. So chaya I'd have to translate as animals, both kosher and non-kosher. And ofot, of course, refers to birds, and of course it does not include fish. So cooking fish in milk is permissible. So Lord Tavashel Gedi, etc. This is going to actually refer to the next verse. We'll do that possibly next time we meet. And he's going to go and say, what has this verse got to do with the next verse, which talks about tithing? Tithing. So what does the one have to do with the other? And Rashi's going to discuss that. And next time we meet, God willing, we'll take a look at it. So I'm going to put in the bookmark. See if I can do that. Okay. Apparently not. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share. And hi, Judith. Good to see you too. Any comments for the record? Otherwise, I will stop the recording.